Hitler wasn't defeated by his enemies. Not really. Britain couldn't reach him. Russia was on its knees. America was an ocean away. He was beaten by the one opponent he could never outsmart, himself. By the summer of 1940, he had nearly won. He held almost all of Europe in his fist. The war was his to finish. 5 years later, he was dead in a bunker, his empire in ashes. So, how does a man who held an entire continent throw it all away? Not bad luck. 5 catastrophic decisions, and every single one was his own choice. Letting Britain escape. In the spring of 1940, the German war machine did the impossible. In a matter of weeks, it overran Western Europe in a campaign so fast and so total that it stunned the world. By June 1940, France, the great military power that had held Germany for 4 bloody years in the First World War, had collapsed. The German army stood triumphant from Norway to the Pyrenees. Hitler was, in that moment, the master of Europe. And then he made his first catastrophic mistake. He let his greatest enemy walk away. It happened at a French port town called Dunkirk. As the German blitzkrieg tore through France in late May 1940, it trapped the entire British Expeditionary Force, the core of Britain's army, along with thousands of French troops against the beaches of the English Channel. Hundreds of thousands of men were pinned, exhausted, surrounded, with their backs to the sea and nowhere to run. The German panzers were closing in for the kill. One decisive push, and Britain's army would have been annihilated, captured, or destroyed in a single stroke. That blow could have knocked Britain out of the war before it truly began. An island with no army cannot fight. And then, on May 24, 1940, the order came down that has baffled historians ever since. Hitler halted the tanks. The exact reasons are still debated. Concerns about the terrain, a desire to preserve the panzers for the rest of the French campaign, Göring's boast that his air force alone could finish the job. Whatever the mix of reasons, the result was a gift to the enemy. For 3 crucial days, the German armor paused while the trapped Allied troops dug in and the evacuation began. What followed was the so-called miracle of Dunkirk. Between May 26 and June 4, 1940, a ragtag armada of warships, ferries, and little civilian boats crossed the channel again and again, under fire, and lifted the army off the beaches. By the end, over 338,000 Allied soldiers, the men who would form the backbone of Britain's future war effort, escaped to fight another day. Hitler had held them in his hand and let them slip through his fingers. But the mistake didn't end there. Hitler still seemed to believe Britain would simply make peace. It didn't. And so he turned to the air to force the issue. Through the summer and autumn of 1940 came the Battle of Britain, the first major battle in history fought entirely in the sky. Hitler's plan was to destroy the Royal Air Force, win control of the air, and clear the way to invade the island. And for a time, it was working. The Luftwaffe pounded British airfields and radar stations, grinding the RAF down, pushing it toward collapse. Then Hitler made the error within the error. In September 1940, in fury and impatience, he switched the bombing campaign away from the airfields and onto British cities, the start of the Blitz against London. It was meant to break British morale. Instead, it broke the German plan. By turning away from the airfields, Hitler gave the battered RAF exactly what it needed, a chance to recover, repair, and rise again. The RAF survived. On September 15, 1940, it bloodied the Luftwaffe so badly that the planned invasion of Britain was postponed and then quietly abandoned forever. Britain lived, and in living, it became the unsinkable aircraft carrier from which the Western Allies would one day return to liberate the continent. Hitler's first great gamble had failed, but the mistake that would truly doom him was still a year away, and it lay to the east. Invading the Soviet Union, here is a rule that the history of warfare writes in blood over and over again. Do not invade Russia. Napoleon learned it. And in 1941, at the very peak of his power, Adolf Hitler decided he knew better. This was the mistake that doomed him. Everything else was a wound. This was the one that became fatal. On June 22, 1941, Hitler launched Operation Barbarossa, the invasion of the Soviet Union. It was the largest land invasion in human history. More than 3 million German and Axis troops, Thousands of tanks, thousands of aircraft, surged across a front stretching over 1,000 miles. And with that single decision, Hitler tore open a second front in the east, while Britain still stood undefeated in the west, committing Germany to a two-front war, the very nightmare that had helped destroy it in the First World War. Why would he do it? Hitler was driven by ideology and arrogance in equal measure. He craved the vast lands and resources of the East. He despised the Soviet system. And above all, he was convinced the Soviet Union was a rotten structure that would collapse at the first hard kick. "We have only to kick in the door," he reportedly said, "and the whole rotten edifice will come crashing down." It was one of the most catastrophic miscalculations ever made by a head of state. At first, it looked like he might be right. The opening months of Barbarossa were a stunning German triumph. The Soviets were caught off guard and reeling. Entire Russian armies were encircled and destroyed. Hundreds of thousands were captured. German tanks raced eastward across the open plains. By the autumn of 1941, the Germans had advanced deep into Soviet territory and seemed unstoppable. But the Soviet Union did not collapse. It bent, it bled, and it kept fighting. Hitler had fatally underestimated three things: the sheer size of the country, the staggering manpower the Soviets could throw into the fight, and the brutal will of a nation fighting for its survival. And then, Hitler made it worse. In the late summer of 1941, with Moscow within reach, he overruled his own generals. Instead of driving straight for the capital, he diverted a powerful armored force south toward Kyiv to capture territory and resources. It won a huge battle, but it cost him something he could never get back: time. By the time the Germans finally turned back toward Moscow, the precious weeks of good campaigning weather were gone, because waiting for them was the oldest enemy of every army that ever marched into Russia: winter. The German soldiers were not equipped for it. Hitler had been so certain of a quick victory that proper winter clothing, equipment, and supplies had not been prepared in adequate numbers. As temperatures plunged far below freezing, German troops froze in their summer gear. Engines wouldn't start, weapons jammed. The lightning advance ground to a halt in the snow and ice just short of Moscow. And then the Soviets struck back. In December 1941, fresh Soviet divisions launched a massive counterattack before Moscow and drove the exhausted, frostbitten Germans back. The capital held. The myth of German invincibility was shattered. The war that Hitler had promised would be over in weeks now stretched out before him as an endless, grinding bloodbath with no end in sight. Germany was now locked into exactly the war it could not win: a vast two-front struggle of attrition against an enemy with limitless space and manpower. And incredibly, in the very same month that his army froze before Moscow, Hitler was about to make another decision that defied all reason, one that would bring the most powerful nation on earth into the war against him. Declaring war on America. Picture this. You are already locked in a death struggle with the largest country on earth. Your army is freezing to death in the snow outside Moscow. You are not winning, and at that exact moment, you choose, completely voluntarily, with no one forcing your hand, to declare war on the most powerful industrial nation in the history of the world. That is precisely what Adolf Hitler did. And it may be the most baffling decision of the entire war. The story begins not in Germany, but in the Pacific. On December 7, 1941, Japan launched a surprise attack on the American naval base at Pearl Harbor in Hawaii. It was Japan's war against America in the Pacific. It had nothing directly to do with Hitler's war in Europe and Russia. The United States, enraged, declared war on Japan the very next day. And here is the crucial point that so many people misunderstand. America did not declare war on Germany. Not yet. The fury of the American public was aimed squarely at Japan. President Roosevelt had wanted to help Britain for a long time, but bringing the United States into the European war against Germany was politically difficult. Many Americans wanted nothing to do with another war across the Atlantic. What? And Hitler solved that problem for him. On December 11, 1941, just 4 days after Pearl Harbor, Adolf Hitler declared war on the United States. He was under no real obligation to do it. The treaty that bound Japan to Japan was defensive in nature, and Japan had been the attacker, not the victim. Hitler could have stayed out. He could have left America focused on the Pacific, fighting Japan, while he dealt with Britain and Russia. Instead, he willingly invited the United States into the war against him, Why? Part of it was contempt. Hitler dismissed America as a weak, Mongol nation, a country he believed was too divided and too soft to fight a serious war. Part of it was a gambler's recklessness, a belief that war with America was coming eventually anyway. He badly, catastrophically misjudged what he was provoking. Because the United States in 1941 was not weak. It was a sleeping giant of almost unimaginable industrial power. Once it fully mobilized, America would outproduce the entire world. Consider the staggering numbers it would pour into the war. Hundreds of thousands of aircraft, tens of thousands of tanks, a navy that would come to dominate 2 oceans at once, and millions upon millions of fresh, well-supplied soldiers. America could build weapons faster than its enemies could destroy them, and it could do so while safe behind 2 vast oceans, its factories untouched by enemy bombs. This is the moment. The basic arithmetic of the war turned permanently against Germany. Hitler was now facing the 3 most powerful forces on the planet at once: the British Empire, the Soviet Union, and the United States, all aligned against him. The combined industrial and human might of that alliance was simply beyond anything Germany could match. It was a contest Germany could not win, no matter how brilliant its soldiers or how advanced its weapons. In a single afternoon, with a single declaration, Hitler had sealed his own doom. He took a regional war he was already struggling to win and turned it into a global war against an unbeatable coalition. His generals understood the danger. Hitler did not. He had let his contempt and his arrogance override every rule of strategy. And now, with the whole world turning against him, the German war machine was about to march into the single greatest disaster in its history. A city on the Volga River, whose name would become a synonym for catastrophe: Stalingrad. Stalingrad and the no-retreat obsession. Every great army has a breaking point, the single battle where its strength is shattered and it never truly recovers. For Hitler's army, that battle had a name, and the tragedy is that the catastrophe was not forced on him by the enemy. He walked into it, and then he refused to walk out. In the summer of 1942, Hitler launched a massive offensive in southern Russia, driving toward the oil fields of the Caucasus that his war machine desperately needed, a major industrial center that happened to carry the name of his greatest enemy, Stalingrad, the city of Stalin. And here Hitler's judgment began to slip from strategy into obsession. Taking Stalingrad became a matter of pride, a symbolic prize, a personal duel between 2 dictators. The German Sixth Army, one of the finest formations in the entire Wehrmacht, was sent to seize it. What followed was some of the most savage fighting of the entire war. Through the autumn of 1942, German and Soviet soldiers tore each other apart in the ruins of the city, fighting street by street, house by house, room by room, in a hell of rubble and fire. The Germans ground forward, paying in blood for every yard, until they held most of the shattered city. But while the Sixth Army was locked in that meat grinder, the Soviets were quietly preparing a trap. On November 19, 1942, they launched a colossal counteroffensive, smashing through the weaker forces guarding the German flanks. Within days, the jaws closed. The entire German Sixth Army, around 250,000 men, was encircled inside Stalingrad, cut off and surrounded. There was still a chance to save them. The army could have attempted to break out of the encirclement and fight its way back to German lines while there was still time. The generals begged for permission to try. Hitler refused. This was the fatal flaw that now took over completely: his obsession with never, ever retreating. To Hitler, a withdrawal was a sign of weakness, a betrayal of his will, a humiliation he could not accept. So he ordered the Sixth Army to stand fast, to hold its position, and to fight where it was to the last man. He convinced himself the trapped army could be supplied entirely from the air, a promise the Luftwaffe had no ability to keep. The airlift failed disastrously, delivering only a fraction of what the soldiers needed to survive. And so the men of the Sixth Army were condemned. Trapped in a frozen, ruined city, they slowly starved and froze through the brutal Russian winter. They ran out of food, out of ammunition, out of hope, while their dictator forbade them to escape and ordered them to die in place for nothing but his pride. On February 2nd, 1943, what was left of the Sixth Army surrendered. The numbers were staggering. Around 250,000 Axis soldiers were killed or captured in the Stalingrad campaign. Of the prisoners marched off into Soviet captivity, only a small fraction would ever see Germany again. Stalingrad was the great turning point of the war in Europe. It was the first time a German field army of that size had been utterly destroyed. The aura of invincibility was gone for good. From this moment on, the Germans in the East were no longer advancing, they were retreating, and they would keep retreating, all the way back to Berlin. And Hitler had learned nothing. The same fatal obsession that doomed Stalingrad, the refusal to ever give ground, the insistence on controlling everything himself, would now drive Germany through 2 more years of catastrophe, all the way to the bunker. Commanding from fantasy, by 1943, a frightening transformation was complete. Adolf Hitler had stopped being a political leader who set the goals and increasingly become the general who ran the battles himself, micromanaging the war down to individual divisions, overruling the professional soldiers who had spent their lives mastering the art of war. And the more the war turned against him, the tighter and more delusional his grip became. This was the final mistake, and it contained all the others. Hitler had come to believe that his own will could bend reality. It could not. The pattern was always the same. His experienced generals would look at a hopeless situation and advise the sensible move, a retreat, a regrouping, a flexible defense to save the army for another day. And Hitler would refuse again and again, ordering his men to stand and hold ground that could not be held, forbidding the withdrawals that might have preserved his forces. Soldiers died in their thousands defending worthless positions because their leader could not tolerate the word retreat. In July 1943, he threw away more of his dwindling strength at the Battle of Kursk, the largest tank battle in history, hurling his precious armored reserves against a Soviet defense that was waiting and ready. It failed, and with it went much of Germany's remaining offensive power in the East. From then on, the German army in Russia was in permanent retreat. Meanwhile, in the West, the reckoning was coming. The Allies were preparing the greatest invasion ever attempted, and Hitler's response showed just how badly his judgment had decayed. On June 6, 1944, D-Day, American, British, and Canadian forces stormed the beaches of Normandy. In those first crucial hours, German tank reserves that might have thrown the invasion back into the sea sat idle, in part because Hitler's rigid command structure would not release them in time. By the time the orders came, it was too late. The Allies were ashore, and they would never be pushed off. Now Germany was being crushed from both directions at once, the Soviets driving in from the east, the Western Allies advancing from the west. And still, Hitler gambled. In December 1944, he scraped together his last reserves for a desperate surprise offensive in the Ardennes forest, the Battle of the Bulge, a final roll of the dice to split the Western Allies. We will protect them. It failed too, and it burned up the last strength Germany had left to defend itself. After that, there was nothing left but the collapse, and in his final months, Hitler descended into pure fantasy. Sealed in his bunker beneath Berlin, as the Soviets closed in, he moved armies across his maps that no longer existed. Phantom divisions, shattered units, formations that had been destroyed weeks before. He raged at his generals for failing him. He blamed everyone but himself. He had lost all contact with the reality crashing down around him. On April 30th, 1945, with Soviet troops just blocks away, Adolf Hitler shot himself. Days later, Germany surrendered. The empire he had built was a smoking ruin, his country occupied, divided, and devastated, with millions upon millions dead across the world because of the war he had unleashed. So how did the man who nearly conquered Europe lose everything? Here is the chilling truth. The very qualities that built his power were the same qualities that destroyed him. The total self-belief that let him gamble and win in the early years became the arrogance that ignored every expert warning. The iron will that drove his rise became the rigid obsession that forbade every retreat. The contempt for others that fueled his ruthlessness became the blindness that underestimated every enemy. Hitler was not brought down by a single brilliant stroke from his enemies. He was brought down, decision by fatal decision, by himself. He held the world in his hand, and he could not stop himself from crushing it over